This is my third video about AMS, and to quickly recap, a large number of settings on the Kross can be adjusted using a number of alternative controls. And in the previous two videos I set out to show how AMS can be used to create some really interesting sounds that can be made to change in pitch, tone and volume after you have pressed a key and then started to manipulate different controls or alternate modulation sources like the pitch wheel, the mod wheel, foot controllers, foot switches, switch 1, switch 2, sustain pedal, etc, etc. The next thing I will look at are the different types of control or sources that can be used to adjust just about everything on this synth. To use the jargon, we'll look at the alternative sources that we can use to modulate some of the synth's parameters. The alternate modulation sources fall typically into two categories. Firstly, there are the hardware controls, referred to by Korg as physical controls. These are basically the switches, the dials, the mod wheel, the pitch wheel, pedals, and any other hardware controls that you can press, push, and physically use your hands and feet. Secondly, you can use MIDI controls. You can create and send MIDI messages which will act as AMS sources to change some of the synth's settings. And these messages can be sent from other synths or they can be sent from within the synth itself. Now that sounds a bit complicated, but we'll explain what this is very shortly and how it works and what MIDI is. I'll go through the available AMS sources and try to give an example of how and where you can use them. But before I do, I'm going to talk about MIDI and MIDI continuous controllers, because these are quite important, because as we'll see, some AMS controllers actually use these messages which will act as the source of modulation and cause the synth settings to change. These control messages can be sent from another synth linked to the Kross or from within the synth itself. Back in the early days of synthesizers, manufacturers all built synthesizers completely differently. As a result, connecting them together and getting them to communicate was impossible. Eventually the top people from the biggest manufacturers got together at a conference, I think it was in 1983, and agreed the MIDI standard. And so although certain settings will differ on each new synthesizer, there are particular features that were agreed that will allow synths to communicate, and you will see on virtually all of the modern synths that are being produced. So a Roland synth, a Korg drum machine and a Yamaha effects unit will all talk to one another. They can all be linked together so that, for example, when you play back a sequence of notes, they can be made to play back in time, irrespective of which manufacturer has produced that particular piece of gear. You'll notice I have 3 keyboards, but like most normal people, I have only one pair of hands. Now all of these machines are made by different manufacturers. However, I can use a 5-pin MIDI cable, with a connector that looks like that, same at the other end, and I can connect these machines together. And I will use these cables and link them together from the MIDI out to the MIDI in socket on the back of the machines. So anything equipped with a MIDI in and a MIDI out socket can be linked via MIDI using MIDI cables. I'm going to start by playing just the Kross. It's a piano sound. And now I'm going to turn up the volume on the Yamaha YS200 I have here. I've got a MIDI cable linking the two. So you can hear that the two are added together, one's triggering the other. I'm going to turn up the Casio. You can hear that additional synth horn type sound that's sitting on top of it. So that's MIDI. That's very, very basic MIDI. One machine talking to another to communicate and produce that really fat sound. What you've just seen me do is use one keyboard to trigger 3 synths. And what that means is I can actually have one keyboard and also trigger modules which have no keyboards. Now I've got a JV1080, an old Roland synthesizer that's hooked up into my system. I'm going to play piano on the Kross. I've got a piano sound, and the strings you're going to hear are going to come from the JV. And I can turn the piano down. Excuse the plane. But you can see I could have a dumb keyboard that actually just sends MIDI messages to other synthesizers, and you can buy them. And you can trigger synths that are on your PC or other hardware synthesizers and modules. So MIDI is quite useful in that respect. Now you'll hear the term master and slave. Basically, that master keyboard is controlling all of the other synthesizers, and they are acting as slaves because they are basically following the commands that I'm sending it, which are basically note on and note off messages. Very simple messages. Now the MIDI standard means I can also send program change messages. So if I change the setting on the Kross, let's put a synth lead on there, for example. You can now hear that I've changed the JV, and the JV is now playing a horn setting. I've still got these two linked in as well. Let's see what's set up on these. There's a horn setting on there as well. Let's change it and do something else. So as you can see, if I put all of my, or save all of my patches in the correct order, I can actually produce some really fat and deep and interesting sounds using a big multi-keyboard or multi-module setup, or controlled from one keyboard. Now the MIDI messages I have spoken about thus far are pretty basic ones. However, with MIDI we can send what are known as MIDI continuous controller messages. So if I hit a key softly or firmly, or use a foot pedal to change the volume on the Kross, if I send a MIDI continuous controller message to the JV or to any of these synths, it will follow not just the switches on and off, but the changes in volume somewhere in between, and it will continuously follow those changes. So if I hit the key nice and gently and then start to get firmer, the whirly piano that I've got in the back, or electric piano that I've got in the back playing on the JV, is following the volume because I'm sending continuous controllers from the Kross. I'm sending continuous controller message number 7, and each of these continuous controls actually has a number, and volume is number 7. Now the pan control is number 10, and the mod wheel is number 1, so don't know whether you can hear that, but I'm actually sending continuous mod wheel messages to the JV that is messing with the vibrato on the piano here and on the JV that's in my rack. Modern synthesizers are able to send and receive lots of different continuous controller messages, or CC messages for short, and we'll meet more of these soon. But it is important to note at this stage that older and cheaper machines may not send or receive every type of CC message. They may not physically be able to, simply because to implement those controllers on some machines is just too costly, or they're too old and the continuous controllers that are being used just didn't apply in the day when they were built. Now the Kross is an entry-level machine. It will therefore receive and be able to react to certain CC messages, but it may not be able to send them. Now we'll see what difference this makes later on, but for now that's MIDI and continuous controller messages.